Let's say you're on your way to the store to buy a hat and you decided $5 sounds like a fair price for a hat. You get to the store with a bunch of your friends and they're all charged $4 for a hat, but the cashier takes a look at you and decides, you know what, for you, it's $5. There's probably a pretty good chance that you're actually not going to buy the hat anymore, even though before you went to the store, you were willing to pay $5. Oddly enough, had the store actually sold the hat to everybody for $5, or even if they sold no other hats except to you for $5, you actually would have ended up walking out of the store with that hat. So not only does fairness impact your day-to-day finances, but if you stick around, I'll explain how it impacts businesses as well as the entire economy. So chances are you've heard of this idea of how people are self-interested, right? They want to make the most amount of money and spend as little as possible, but yet there are scenarios where people are willing to spend a little bit of extra money. Let's reverse that hat example for a moment and say that all your friends are charged $5 for a hat, but the cashier takes a look at you and decides, you know what, for you that hat is $4, and then you're surrounded by your group of friends. You're probably going to feel this pressure to decide, you know what, I will pay full price at that $5 rate. The actual guilt of taking that lower price and kind of the societal or peer pressure ends up causing you to spend more money, with the exception of probably, the cashier having a crush on you and you accept that lower price. You're probably actually going to accept that higher price, even though it's not in your own self-interest to do so. Or should I at least clarify and say your own financial self-interest? This all relates to this idea of fairness and economic decision-making. And what that all means is basically that there's a benefit and an actual value to fairness, and there's actually a cost to unfairness as well. Economists and psychologists actually found a way to kind of test this idea with a game they called The Dictator. So let me lay out the rules for this game. Basically, you're given $100 between you and a complete stranger, and you're given full power on how you allocate that $100. You can either decide to keep it all for yourself, you could give away the whole entire $100 to the other person, or you could split it in some kind of way. The obvious rational thing or self-interested thing that most people would do is just keep the $100. Why do you owe any money to the stranger? But on average, when people tested this game, on average, they found out that people would only keep about 70 to at most 85% of that actual $100. And this was pretty groundbreaking stuff, because if you ever taken like a basic economic class, or if you heard politicians talk on the news, they always have this basic assumption that people are always self-interested and would never do anything that wasn't in their, full financial interest. On top of this, economists came up with a different game called Ultimatum, and this game worked a little bit differently. You see, basically the way it worked is you're still given $100 between you and a complete stranger. But the difference is that the stranger got to decide whether or not to accept or reject the offer. And if they did reject the offer, then neither person actually ended up with any of the money. So on the one hand, you want to keep as much money as possible. So you would, maybe offer something like $80 or $90. But the other person may find that so unfair that rather than them getting the $10 or $20 that they would have gotten, they'd rather reject the offer, ensuring that you're not getting any money, even though they aren't getting any money either. But on the flip side too, you wouldn't necessarily want to offer too much money, because then you're kind of losing out on this opportunity, right? If I offered $90 to the other person, I only got to keep 10, maybe they were accepting, willing to accept something between 50-50. So I'm actually losing money, or losing the opportunity to gain that money, just because I'm being overly generous. So on average, what they found was that most people offered somewhere between 40 to 50%. 50 being obvious because, most people would find that fair. 40%, because it's just barely enough that you're still coming out ahead, but not enough to tempt the other person to reject the offer altogether. And what they also found was that if anybody offered less than 20% to the other person, so in this case, if I offered someone $20 or $10, that was pretty much an immediate rejection to the offer. What's even more interesting about all of this is that our idea of fairness and where that comes from changes, and it begins to morph based on different societal factors. So back to that hat example, instead of a group of friends walking into the store with you, let's say it's just a group of strangers, and now you're being offered, that discounted price of $4, whereas everybody else is being offered $5. You see, with the group of friends, you would have ended up rejecting that offer because the societal pressure or the peer pressure or the guilt was just so strong you'd rather pay full price. Whereas with a group of strangers, that pressure isn't necessarily there as much, and you may actually accept that offer even though you know it's unfair to others. Speaking of fairness, by the way, I did put a lot of effort and research into this video, and if you didn't hit that like button for me, I'd find that a little bit unfair. And here's another example for you. Let's say you and a coworker are working the exact same job, and you both have the exact same pay and the exact same qualifications, and everything is the exact same. But then the CEO decides to walk in that day and looks at your coworker and decides, you know what, they're going to get a $2,000, pay raise as far as their salary, and you don't get any pay raise. You probably find that pretty unfair, but you probably would be willing to put up with it. Now let's change up this example a little bit. Instead of the CEO making the decision, let's say the CEO brought their 12-year-old son that day, and the 12-year-old son decided, I think the, coworker should get paid $2,000 more, and the company actually went with this, and they actually paid the other person $2,000 more a year. You probably find that so unfair, you'd probably be walking out that exact same day. So this example really illustrates pretty well on how we can rely on authority figures or even experts as kind of our perception of fairness. And I'm not necessarily saying that's a good or bad thing. I'm just acknowledging that, we kind of rely on certain people as far as what our idea of fairness actually is. So why does any of this idea of fairness matter? Well, for one, in that wage example, how much you make in comparison to other people for the exact same line of work really directly impacts on how long you're willing to work at that company, or that, in general, they call that employee retention. So as a business, this is actually something you care about because employee retention actually has a cost. So in a scenario where someone was willing to take $10 an hour for, a certain line of work, even though that everybody else is making around $12 an hour, and that's where they started off at too, then it probably might be to your benefit actually to pay them a little bit more, just because of the fact that once they do start working at your company, they're probably going to be looking for a new job pretty soon once they find out that everybody else is making $2 more an hour for the same line of work. So it's pretty clear that fairness has a value in the workplace, and this is why some companies issue, a transparency program. Everybody can see on what the wage rate that everybody else is making. And on top of that, other companies too kind of have an objective list as far as when people qualify for a certain pay bump. So rather than just kind of keeping it open air and everybody can just kind of decide when they want to argue for a pay raise, there's an objective kind of list or standard as far as, you've been working here 2 years, so you qualify for a 4% pay bump. And that kind of keeps this fairness really in mind at the workplace. And it's not too far of a stretch of the imagination to kind of see how this fairness and wage all applies to the greater economy, which kind of relates to this whole gender pay issue that a lot of people have bringing up lately. And this becomes even more of an issue because everybody has a different perception of that, fairness aspect that I was talking about. Everybody has a different authority figure or expert that they rely on. So if everybody's value and perception of fairness is different, then it becomes increasingly difficult for, a government program or several different government programs to be perceived as fair to everybody. And without getting a little too philosophical here, there can be a little bit of wiggle room, so to speak, as far as how much injustice people are willing to put up with as far as a society viewing fairness. In all these examples that I explained, as far as, the $10 person or the $2,000 pay bump or even the hat example, if we change the scale or scope of the different examples, that can really, emphasize on how much injustice we're willing to tolerate. For example, if I was making $10 an hour and everybody else was making $11 an hour, that might be something I'm willing to tolerate or at least put up with for a little while. But if somebody, if I was still making $10 an hour and everybody else was making $20 an hour, that's an injustice that's just a little bit too big for me to handle. So this whole idea of unfairness, we see pretty well illustrated with kids, because if you split a sandwich in half between two different kids, if there's even just a little bit of one size being larger than another, you can pretty much bet that one kid is going to scream out that it's unfair. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that adults and businesses haven't grown up too much from those days of playing on the playground. That's it for this video. If you appreciate this video, please give it a big thumbs up. And if you like personal finance, business, economics, or these kind of behavioral economic issues, please hit that subscribe button and let me know down below if you appreciate these videos so that I know that I can make another, behavioral economics type video. So hit that subscribe button. I hope to see you in the next one.